Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Nowak. An introduction by Shelley Fisher Fishkin to a volume of Mark Twain has interested me in Huckleberry Finn in a way that nothing else has ever done. Not so much making me want to rush out and read it, but it's caused me to think about it in a different way. And I'd just like to read some parts of paragraphs from the introduction that struck me. In Tom Sawyer, Twain had evoked aspects of the world that he had lived in as a child without bringing to bear on that world the moral awareness he had acquired as an adult. Hannibal had been a slave-holding town, a fact fairly easy to forget in Tom Sawyer. In his schoolboy days, Twain later recalled in his autobiography, he had no aversion to slavery and was not aware that there was anything wrong about it. But now Twain was becoming increasingly aware of the dynamics of racism and increasingly embarrassed by his failure to question the racist status quo of the world in which he had grown up. While his own father, John Marshall Clemens, had been serving on a jury that sent slave stealers to the state penitentiary, his father-in-law, Jervis Langdon, had been funding slave stealers' activities. The town of Elmira in upstate New York, where Twain spent summers after his marriage to Jervis Langdon's daughter, Olivia, was proud of its abolitionist heritage. Conversations with his father-in-law, his wife, and other members of her family, as well as conversations with former slaves living in Elmira, helped prompt Twain to re-examine the moral underpinnings of the world in which he had grown up. Move on to another part. When Twain began writing Huckleberry Finn, he thought he was writing another boy's book, a sequel to Tom Sawyer. But Twain soon found himself with several hundred pages of a manuscript increasingly less like Tom Sawyer and more like no book that anyone, including Twain himself, had ever written before. It was about a child who grows up in a world in which no one, including that child, questions the God-given legitimacy of the institution of slavery, a world in which people who think of themselves as supremely civilized endorse a system that is uncivilized, illegitimate, and inhumane. By the end of August, Twain had the child narrator throw his lot in with the runaway slave and set off on a journey whose end for the slave was to be freedom. But the writing stalled, and Twain put the child and the slave ashore and shelved the manuscript. Given the changes in Twain's moral universe in recent years, his failure for the first 30 years of his life to defy or even question the institution of slavery and the racism that supported it must have troubled him. Can you remake yourself? He must have wondered. further on. The most obvious surface difference between the two books is, of course, the choice of narrator, the point of view and the language that it engenders. Tom Sawyer is narrated by a genial, mature, sophisticated voice that occasionally refers to itself as the writer of this book. ... Huckleberry Finn, by way of contrast, is narrated by Huck himself, an engaging, vernacular-speaking urchin who is unconcerned with the niceties of proper grammar. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. Something new happened in Huckleberry Finn that had never happened in American literature before. It was a book that transformed American prose style, that served as a declaration of independence from the genteel English novel tradition. Huckleberry Finn allowed a different kind of writing to happen, a clean, crisp, no-nonsense, earthy, vernacular kind of writing that jumped off the printed page with unprecedented immediacy and energy. It was a book that talked, and more than any American novel before it, it talked in cadences and rhythms that bore the mark of the voices of African Americans to whom Twain had listened intently and appreciatively throughout his life. The introduction takes all of those points in greater detail, but I'd never seen the books compared like that. Over the years, I've picked up two separate Penguin editions of it. So the one has an introduction by R. Kent Rasmussen, and the other has an introduction by John Seeley. And I'm sure I've looked at those introductions, and for some reason, I've been skeptical. For one, I don't really like the tone of the narrator. I never have, and I've realized from reading this introduction that that is the thread which accounts for my dislike of various other American novels, that overly colloquial, jokey kind of tone. The introduction also mentioned that the last, third or so of Huckleberry Finn is increasingly becoming read as a satire on the trials and tribulations that African Americans living in the United States have had to endure subsequent to the failure or the abandonment of the Reconstruction programs. I don't like satire very much. So all of that helps to account for my reluctance to jump into these books, which you occasionally come across time to time. I think I have seen at the charity or someplace the Penguin edition of of the Penguin edition of Tom Sawyer, and not picked it up. And while I like this introduction, I'm still on the fence about whether I should read Huckleberry Finn. I think I would have a better grasp if I read it not so much in terms of reading it as a classic American novel, but reading it as a sort of map of Mark Twain's own internal moral dilemmas, coming somewhat late to the repugnance or abhorrence of the institution of slavery. So for the first time, I'm thinking of it, although I've heard there are a lot of textual problems with Huckleberry Finn. It may well be a video by Steve Donahue that suggests as much. And so for that reason, you know, one of the best books I read last year was The Prince and the Pauper, which I believe is his second solo novel effort. I read it in that introduction. I can't remember, so I may have that wrong. And the third was Huck Finn, or Huckleberry Finn. And this was a perfectly realized story. It was a faultless masterpiece, in my humble opinion. But you note it completely shies away from the American topic for which Twain later becomes famous. At some other time I picked this up. This is the other Twain story that I've been interested in reading. And just as I'm looking at it now, I'm noting, well, this is also another one that takes place in long ago, far away. And so how much of my reluctance with Huckleberry Finn stems from a similar reluctance to examine my own feelings about the subject? I don't know. And so that is making me think that perhaps I should give it a chance. The introduction here mentioned that Twain at first started writing Huckleberry Finn and had all these pages, and it was taking off in a direction that he wasn't sure about. And then he set the manuscript aside for some while and only returned to it later. So all of this really makes me think that Huckleberry Finn is a book that I probably should read. And I wonder how much I should read it in conjunction with Tom Sawyer. This is a marvelous Signet mass market paperback. People have talked on BookTube about their love for these old editions, and I do have to agree. The font really is no smaller, I think, than these penguins. Only minorly smaller, a lot tighter. But I don't, of course, have to read it in this edition, but I've been thinking that perhaps I should keep this and get rid of those other two Huckleberry Finns. I'll have to relook at the introductions and see if they're worth holding on to. But so I think I will put this into my pile of possibilities, definitely. And yes, just as I'm talking, I think I will take this as a solid unit. It's only 250 pages, for gosh sakes. And if Mark Twain is responsible for that, gee whiz, by gosh, unreliable narrator, satirical tone that I dislike so much in narrators. I mean, I much prefer the narrator as described in Tom Sawyer, the omniscient, sort of a wise, knowing voice with very little personality to it. I much prefer that kind of a narrator. But I think bearing with Huckleberry Finn for 150 pages or 125 pages, whatever it is not really that hard of a sacrifice, especially having loved The Prince and the Pauper like I did. I probably owe it to myself to read Huck Finn before I read the Connecticut Yankee. So those are just thoughts. Thank you much for stopping by my channel.